Florida authorities say a 9-year-old boy begged for help in a Post-it note that led to the arrest of his stepmother, and the woman is now accused of abusing him in horrific fashion. We're going to get into what we learned from a key document in this case and what we can expect to happen next. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. Jesse Weber. Please help us. Please help us. Those three chilling words changed everything, because according to Miami, Florida authorities, it was those words that were apparently written on a Post-it note by a 9-year-old boy that led to the arrest of his 25-year-old stepmother, Katrina Carrillo. So we believe we're talking about her boyfriend's son here. And this, by the way, also led to the removal of him and his brother by the Department of Children and Families. We're talking about DCF. Now, here's what else we know. According to the criminal complaint in this case, the arrest affidavit, while the boy reportedly wrote this message on March 4th, it was on April 9th when he was forensically interviewed, and apparently he recounted how he was physically abused, smothered, and his breathing restricted, all at the hands of Miss Carrillo. Now, we're not going to get into more details about the allegations, but just to say they're disturbing. Okay, they're disturbing, to say the least. And this allegedly happened when he was 8 years old. According to the paperwork, the officer conducted an audio-recorded statement with the defendant, the suspect, Miss Carrillo, and after she was apparently read her Miranda rights, she agreed to speak without a lawyer present. Now, the affidavit reads, quote, "The defendant denied all allegations, advising that she disciplines her children and not her boyfriends." The defendant was arrested and transported to the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center. And yes, it has been reported that she was released from custody after posting $5,000 bail. She was instructed to keep away from both of her boyfriend's children. Reporting indicates she's facing a felony child abuse charge, which we're going to discuss. And reporting from various outlets indicates that her legal representative couldn't be reached for a comment. By the way, we also checked out Carrillo's background on Truthfinder, and according to its criminal history search, she has been cited for multiple traffic infractions over the years, including knowingly driving with a suspended license, failing to stop for red lights or stop signs, not having a child correctly restrained in a car seat. Tell you what, Law&Crime, we partner with Truthfinder. We use it to get details on people involved in our stories, but even if you don't work in true crime, it is an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. Why? It's one of the largest public record search services in the United States, and with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. So right now, I want to bring on victims' rights attorney John Phillips to talk a little bit more about this. John, thanks so much for taking the time to come here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jesse.
From what I can see, and I can't really understand it, and what I haven't seen reported are the circumstances behind why the boy allegedly wrote this note. Who saw it? Who was this note written to? Any ideas? I mean, can you read through the tea leaves about how something like this would have transpired?
No, clearly we have a gap between a Post-it note with "Please help us," basically an 8-year-old handwriting, and DCF. And so I don't know whether it was a school teacher or, left it in some conspicuous place or got a trusted family member to kind of call 911. But, either way, the good news is this young child knew to ask for help and knew to report this, because sometimes children are afraid, they're afraid that both of retaliation, but also that their circumstances are going to change. Mommy and daddy won't love them or that this will negatively impact their future. And so, good for the young child to report this abuse.
How does DCF usually get involved?
Through reports, and a report, much like any investigative agency, they have to deal with reasonable suspicion and probable cause. But, if they get a reasonable report, now they get in divorce cases, they get a lot of reports that, probably shouldn't be made and could be, the subject of malicious prosecution. But, they can get calls from, a number of ways. There's a website, a phone number, but, they then kind of do a bit of a background investigation and hear, the evidence is that a post-it note saying "please help" is certainly a victim asking for help, and that's something that would be taken, obviously seriously.
Yeah, if the allegations are true, do we see this often of a minor victim, I mean, 9 years old, being able to communicate what happened to them? I mean, that's a rarity because usually we cover cases where those children can't speak up. They don't have the opportunity. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they don't have an outlet. Maybe they can't tell their teachers. Maybe they can't tell family members. So if you think about this allegation and if it's true and if it means please help us means please help us from our stepmother, do you see cases like that often?
We're seeing it more, unfortunately, and I'm particularly sensitive to it because I have 13, 10, and 7-year-old boys at home. And so, you try to surround them with, the best, daycare it's me and my wife and, we try to give them the best care we can. But when you bring, other people into the home and here, Katrina Carrillo was like the girlfriend, 25, I think, years old, fairly young. And, she shouldn't be the one parenting. She shouldn't be the one handing out discipline and certainly should never be using the level of punishment and smothering that's alleged here.
What did you make of her statement? Right? I thought if that was true, an interesting statement makes it post Miranda, so she's read her rights, decides to allegedly provide a statement without a lawyer present that while she disciplines her children, she didn't discipline her boyfriend's children. What do you take away from that statement if it's true?
Yeah, I mean it's an attempt at denial, but again, once you start talking, you're opening yourself up to scrutiny and interpretation. I think this child will present alternative facts, right? A different story, and it's just sad, and kind of going back to the core of the last couple of questions, we really hope that these children will report it. I get it. It's scary. You're not quite sure what's going on, and we're going to get into it, in the next story too. Sometimes you're kind of lured into it. But adults shouldn't be abusive. Adults shouldn't be, giving you drugs, alcohol, or sexual favors.
Well, let me ask you something about this, right? So first, take a step back here. When I saw the headline and I heard the allegations, I said to myself, this is not the first time I've heard of a case of a partner, a romantic partner, abusing or allegedly abusing the children of their partner. I feel like that happens a lot. And why do you see that happening? It'll become a question of what did the partner know or not know, but I feel like I see that a lot of times, no?
I think it does. It's not your child, right? So when a child is born, there's hopefully a massive amount of love that sweeps, into you, and you don't have that natural protection instinct of somebody not your child, but people with any human decency certainly wouldn't want anybody's child to be harmed like this. And so, we do see it more with people of not of the same bloodline, but tragic nonetheless.
A lot of this information, if not all of the information, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, comes from this forensic interview that was done with the child. When you're dealing with a forensic interview of a young child like this, what does that look like? How is that structured? That's a very, very unique conversation.
Yeah, both from the Department of Children and Family perspective and law enforcement, there are dedicated investigators that are used to working with children, trained to work with children. And I've taken the deposition of a 6-year-old, and an 18-year-old, 17-year-old, all the way up. And you do have to use different strategies and explain things in different ways, and try to get the child to open up, while also understanding that they're not as worldly, or they will, they don't know the repercussions often for lying. They don't deal with an adult world. And so it takes different, psychological ability through your questioning to try to get to the heart of the matter and figure out what's true, and re-ask questions a different way to try to verify the information that you're getting. But again, I have a 7-year-old now. He's a very sharp 7-year-old, but he could relay all of the abuse. He could certainly talk about in detail. By 7, they do understand the world around them, quite a bit.
See, here's the thing, though. It appears that she's facing this child abuse charge, right? And I want to define it right now, our understanding. It's a person who knowingly or willfully abuses a child without causing great bodily harm, permanent disability, or permanent disfigurement to the child commits a felony of the 3rd degree. And my understanding is a 3rd-degree felony can carry up to 5 years in prison. The issue with this, John, from a legal point of view, since there is no serious injury where you can document, oh my gosh, look what happened to this child, is it all come back to the testimony, the account of this young child? If there's no medical examination, if there's no physical proof of this abuse, if it only comes down to what this young child says, is that sufficient for prosecution? Is that sufficient for a conviction?
It's going to be a tough case. These cases are certainly tough when you're relying on the testimony of a young child. And in cases we've represented victims, the emotion, we've argued the emotional trauma, the PTSD, the significant, harm done to the soul, qualifies for the upcharge, right? It is a permanent injury. And same thing with sprains and strains and whiplash incidents. Like the prosecutors and police tend not to quite get that you can have a permanent injury from a from a whiplash incident, which caused by battery. And so but here it's but you also can't let somebody off merely because they didn't break a bone. And they're going to have to get into some other levels of corroborating evidence. You'd want somebody else to talk about the abuse in the household, or some contemporaneous reporting to kind of seal up the case or shore up the case. But yeah, you're exactly right. It's these are difficult cases to put before a jury.
How would you, let's say it actually proceeds and it proceeds to a trial. Does this 9-year-old, maybe 10-year-old, when they ultimately have to testify, 11-year-old, do they have to take the stand? I can't imagine that you can just have a law enforcement officer talk about what the child said in a forensic interview. I feel like you would need the child to testify, which is probably why, if you're a prosecutor, you would maybe not want this case to go to trial, not have to have this alleged minor victim take the stand, have a jury hear all this. But it seems to me that would be the only way to secure a conviction here. And that could be
perfect.
Tough for the prosecution. But I also want to know, like, how would the defense cross-examine a child like this?
That's exactly right. Perfect example is the case you and I have both worked on. Y&W Melly, there's reports of him being abused, physically abused by his stepfather to the point he got sent to the hospital, but he wouldn't testify. And so the charges were dropped, and he wound up living with his grandmother and blah, blah, blah. But same example, if you have family pressure not to testify, or you have a child that simply doesn't want to deal with this in their day-to-day life, or wants to, be a kid, the case falls apart, and you potentially have an abuser that's just out there.
If the charges are dropped, right, or she's acquitted, could she have contact with this child again? I don't know if there'd be anything preventing her from not having contact with the child if the legal case is over. No.
There's 3 layers. So there's certainly the criminal prosecution layer. DCF can have separate requirements, and then there's the potential for an injunction, which somebody would have to apply for, related to child abuse. And so there can be multiple inputs. Think of a TV. There can be multiple inputs to prevent the child and the adult from being in the same space. But typically, once there's a dismiss, null pros, or acquittal, the assumption is that person's innocent and they can go back to the status quo.
The time frame there, I think, is interesting as well, about when this alleged abuse happened, when it was communicated, when there was an interview with the child. I'm putting my legal cap on to try to understand this. Do you think that this is the type of case that she maybe would plead guilty to? You know, you move away from the headache of a trial, the uncertainty of a trial, potentially 5 years in prison. My understanding, and what would a guilty plea look like? Would it be probation?
Yeah, if she doesn't have a history, what I would expect is her legal team, if that's where they're headed, is to, try to get it down to a simple battery, so that it's not child abuse, right? That will have lasting ramifications in your record. Future employers would look at it if it's not necessarily a purgeable offense in Florida. And so I would suspect if if she did this, you take the stance of, look, the child is wrong about the facts. There was some discipline, and get into the conversation about what is discipline and how it's changed. And here there's a level of almost suffocation allegation, and you know to go back to the question, if she could get this down to like a misdemeanor battery or simple battery, it's a probation type thing.
If she takes it to trial and she loses, could she get 5 years in prison for something like this?
She absolutely could. It would take some decent testimony, and then the sentencing hearing, the judge would hear from a number of witnesses on both sides, including potentially the victim, about the impact. And if this kid, or a psychologist testifies that there's PTSD and significant trauma coming from this, certainly that book of 5 years isn't that deep if or lengthy if you have somebody that didn't take responsibility for their actions, and a child said that they were suffocated and abused, again going off the allegations so far.
Do you usually see the defendant take the stand and explain their actions in child abuse cases?
No, I wouldn't hear. You could potentially get some of your case through obviously cross-examination of any victim, which would be real tough here, but also some level of uh, you know counselor, or even cross-examining the police about what physical evidence of abuse, because there's not going to be any. You're not going to
Right.
see the welts, you're not going to see bruising after all this time. And then you just go to the jury and say, look, she she really didn't discipline this boyfriend's children at all. And at some point, were they playing, were they, was there roughhousing? Yeah, but you know my client's innocent.
It's a catch-22. They have this statute on the books because you don't have to wait for a serious injury for it to be child abuse, but it does make it potentially more difficult to successfully prosecute these cases without that physical evidence. And that's what makes it interesting. Now, detectives have asked anybody with information about this or other cases to call the Miami-Dade County Crime Stoppers at 305-471-8477. They can remain anonymous. John, typically in these kinds of cases, do you expect people to come forward? Again, this is an allegation. This could be an isolated incident. We don't know if anybody else will contact authorities, but what do you usually see in cases that maybe are like this, or just generally in child abuse cases?
We've had similar cases, and I've put the mugshot and a call to action on out there myself. With do you know anything about this person? And Crime Stoppers does it with some level of anonymous reporting. They use code numbers. Sometimes there's a reward for the information, but yeah, you'd want another witness. Ideally, you'd want. I mean, you do, but also you don't want to abuse kids, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
the catch 22 of it. You hope that this was just an isolated incident, but the fact is, abusers tend to continue the systemic abuse, that whether they've been through it or they've just figured out that this is the way they're going to win the power dynamic. But it's really sad.
Absolutely. Very sad indeed. Just a chilling case, to say the least. John Phillips, thank you so much for coming on. Good seeing you.
Good seeing you.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.